Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Data Toolbox for MATLAB. I am Chad A. Greene from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly is the El Niño Southern Oscillation and how can we quantify it. And to do that, we're going to be using the Climate Data Toolbox, and I'll be putting this code down in the description of the video below so you can follow along if you miss any steps. If you haven't already checked out the video on trends in global warming, that might be a good place to start, but you can also just jump in on this one and probably follow along just fine. So what we're going to be doing here is starting with the example data that comes with CDT, this specific SST data, and we'll say whose. And whose tells us what variables are in this data set and what size. So in this example data, we have latitude, longitude, SST, and time. SST is a 60 by 55 by 802. That's a data cube where the first two dimensions correspond to latitude and longitude, and the third dimension is time. Here, time is a double. It's not a date string, or it's also not a date time vector. It's just a number. So this is a number since the year 0. If we enter now, it gives a date num, and this says there have been over 738,000 days since day 1 of year 0. So if we look at the date time, or the date numbers in our date vector, we see that our data corresponds to January 1950 to October 2016. And you could do the math for 802 time steps in between, but a simple way to say, well, what is the temporal resolution, is say the mean difference between each time step is about 30 days. So this is a monthly data set from 1950 to 2016. Now, if we're interested in calculating El Nino, the easiest way to do that in Climate Data Toolbox is simply to use the ENSO function, El Niño Southern Oscillation Index. And the ENSO function takes SST data, raw SST data, with time, and then the corresponding grid points in that SST data. And it'll give you an index of El Nino values for the time series. And we can plot it with the anomaly function. When we do that, we get this nice plot of a time series where we have a few peaks that are known El Nino events in the 1980s, in the late 1990s, and so on. And that's a very convenient way to do it. We see, okay, El Nino events seem to happen every few years. And if you're curious about how frequently they occur, you can use the plotpsd function to plot the power spectral density. And this tells us exactly what we would expect, is that the El Nino index has energy between the 2 and 5 or 7 year interval, and that's exactly part of the definition of El Nino, or part of our best understanding of El Nino. Now, if you're not clear on the definition of El Nino, well, there's one person who can help us understand it.
For those of you who don't habla español, El Niño is Spanish for the Nino.
Thanks, Chris. And we can even go more further in depth with that understanding by exploring this SST data set instead of just jumping straight to the answer with the ENSO function. So again, this SST data set is a data cube where the third dimension is time. So if we want to just get a map of SST, the mean SSTs over the past several decades, you can calculate the mean along the third dimension. And that's what we get here. Of course, the warmer colors are in the middle near the equator, and then as you get farther away from the equator, it gets colder. You can also calculate the trend. And if you've seen the video on trends, this should look very familiar. Now, we want to go a little bit further than just means and trends with empirical orthogonal functions. So that's the topic we're going to delve into now. So EOFs are a way of identifying the modes of variability of a system. And for example, we might look at the modes of a drumhead. And if you think about a drumhead, it has this fundamental mode where, of course, the edges are clamped, but then the very center of the drumhead is going up and down and up and down. And basically the whole drum head is following that pattern of either going up or in a down state. It's either up state or the down state. And similarly, there's higher modes, where sometimes you get the left and the right side of the drum head are doing opposite things. So as you get higher and higher in these modes of variability of a drum head, you get more and more complex shapes. Now that's with a very simple example of a drum, but a drum is about the simplest system that you can model in terms of modes of variability. As you get more complex shapes, like for example the modes of a guitar body, you see that these modes are a little bit less predictable in their spatial patterns. And so when we talk about the modes of variability of the Pacific Ocean, we have to think about this ocean that has this irregular shape, and it's also being acted on by forces like wind stress that really affect the modes of variability, but nonetheless, you'll still have fundamental patterns where parts of the water tend to behave in unison with other parts of the water around it. And so EOFs are all about exploring those patterns and trying to understand what happens in one place and how does it affect what happens around it and so forth. So the simplest way we can do this is plot the first mode of sea surface temperatures. And when we do this, we'll be plotting the main mode of variability of sea surface temperatures from 1950 to about 2016. And what we get here is this funny pattern. Well, it's I guess somewhat unexpected. You see, okay, well, there's cold colors up north and warm colors down south. So that means when the northern hemisphere is cold, the southern hemisphere is warm, and vice versa. This is a pretty strange fundamental mode of variability, but then when you think about it, of course, that's exactly what you'd expect, because over the past several decades, the fundamental mode of variability, everywhere except for maybe very close to the equator, has been related to the seasonal cycle. So if we just pick a random point, say this little black square in the Pacific, we can plot the time series of that point, and we see, in fact, almost all of this variability, it isn't associated with any kind of long-term year-to-year changes, but rather it's interannual variability, these seasonal cycles that really dominate the variability of sea surface temperatures. So what we want to do is we want to deseason it. So we can use the deseason function just to very quickly deseason this 1D array of sea surface temperatures. And then what we're left with is these residuals are just the interannual variability or other short-term variability that isn't associated with the average seasonal pattern. Now we can do this for the whole grid, for the whole data cube. Instead of just doing it for a single grid cell, we can apply the deseason function to the entire SST data cube and then output it as something, we'll call it sea surface temperatures deseasoned. And then when we plot the first mode of the deseasoned EOF, then we are already starting to see something like exactly what we would expect, this classic ENSO pattern. But we should go one step further. Even though we've removed the seasonal cycle, there is still a long-term trend in there. So really we want to use the Detrend3 function to detrend along the third dimension of the data cube. And then we'll end up with this variable, let's call it sea surface temperatures deseasoned and detrended. Now that we have sea surface temperatures deseasoned and detrended, just as a fun thing, we can recreate figure 2 of Messi and Chavez, 2011, where they plot simply the variance of the sea surface temperature anomalies. So to do that, we'll plot the variance of these sea surface temperature anomalies that we've calculated so far. So the variance along the third dimension. And here I'm using the jet color map only because I'm trying to recreate exactly the results of Messi and Chavez, which in fact do look very similar. Okay, so we're at this point where we can start looking at what are the different modes of variability in this deseasoned, detrended sea surface temperature data. And for that, we can use the EOF function. And the EOF takes in a data cube and then gives you maps of EOFs, gives you the principal component time series, and then the explained variance. And for this example, we'll just compute the first 6 modes of variability. The way EOFs work is there's usually one mode for every time step that you have. And in this case, we have 802 time steps, and that's really more than we need. It's computationally more expensive to calculate any more modes than you need. And usually anything after the first few modes is noise anyway. So we'll just calculate for this example the first 6. And we'll use whos again just to explore what we have so far. So what this tells us is we have these EOF maps. They're data cubes where the first 2 dimensions correspond to latitude and longitude. And that third dimension is just 6 different modes of variability. The PC variable is the principal component time series. So for each of the 6 modes of variability, we have 802 time series entries. And then we'll get to the explained variance in a second. But right now, let's just plot the very first mode of variability. And that's what we have here. In this left corner, we have a map of the very fundamental mode of variability in the deseasoned, detrended sea surface temperature data. And on the right-hand side, that's the time series corresponding to that mode. So what this tells us is that at any point in time, if we want to know how much this mode is contributing to the overall sea surface temperature anomaly for that given time, you just multiply this map by this time series at that time. And similar, we can go to the second and third modes. And what we see here is we have a map for each mode and then a unique time series for each mode as well. And typically what happens is that in the lower order modes, the first and second mode, you have these large spatial patterns that are smooth and not very noisy, and you have low frequency variability. But then in the higher order modes, you start to get into more small patterns, more noise, and then higher frequency variability as you get higher and higher into these modes. So one of the outputs of the EOF function is the explained variance. And what it tells you is that how much does each mode contribute to the overall variability in the signal that we have. And what this tells us is that the first mode of variability explains about 37% of the variance in this in the sea surface temperature data. And the second mode is about 8 or 9%, and so on. And really, if you go past the first few modes, you just start getting into very small variability, noise, and generally stuff that almost looks interpretable, but beware, because it's easy to start seeing patterns you want to see in the higher order modes. So just to play it safe, I usually stick with just the first few modes. But what does this tell us? This tells us, okay, well, we've got a map of variability for each one of these modes of vibration. And so this is sort of like that drumhead where we have the very first mode, and whenever it's red, usually the blue is doing some opposite phase behavior. And we have that for the first mode, the second mode, the third mode, and so on. But what can this tell us? Well, let's take a look at the very first time series, or very first time step in the data. And on the left-hand side, we're just plotting the observed sea surface temperature anomalies as they are in SST, DS, DT. That's the detrended, deseasoned SST map. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the EOF map multiplied by that first principal component value in that time series. So this says, okay, for that very 1950 data, you just multiply this value times this map, and you get the sea surface temperature anomaly associated with mode 1 variability. And what we see is that, in fact, these two maps do look pretty similar in some ways. You see the same red pattern in the northern Pacific, and the same blue right in the equatorial regions. But the first mode of variability does not have much information about what's going on along the east coast of the United States. So what's interesting about this is that each mode contains some kind of information. Sometimes that information is meaningful, like the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index, and then other times it's just noise. What's interesting is you can start building up and reconstructing a time series based on which modes you want to include. So for example, here we've only mapped the very first mode, but what if we start adding these together? So for example, the first mode of the EOF plus the second mode plus the third, all for that first time step in the time series. And here we're adding the first 6 modes together, and we're going to replace just this first mode with the first 6 modes. And already we can see that if you analyze the first 6 modes of variability, it's starting to look a lot more like the observed sea surface temperatures for January of 1950. It's just looks very similar but less noisy. And so that's actually something that gets used sometimes, is we use EOFs as a way to remove noise from a system. Rather than having to manually multiply each principal component times the EOF maps to reconstruct time series, there is an REOF function, reconstruct EOF or REOF. So for example, if we just want to look at the first 5 modes and reconstruct sea surface temperature anomalies that way, we can just use the REOF function to do so. And now I'm going to animate both time series. I'm just going to look at the first 10 years of data, that's the first 120 months. And for each time step, we'll replace the color data with the observed sea surface temperature anomaly, and then this reconstructed one. And what we see here are very similar patterns. The one on the right is a bit cleaner because we've removed noise, just we're only keeping the first few modes of variability. But on the left one, that's actually the observations. So whether those observations are measurement noise or just other physics that we haven't accounted for, I don't know. But this is just to give an intuition for how to start building time series from principal components. As just a tip, check out the GIF function. There's a GIF function in CDT which makes it really simple to generate GIFs like from animations like this. All right, so we're talking about EOFs, but how does this relate to El Nino? There's a few different ways to define El Nino, and one common way to do it is just to look at sea surface temperatures in this range of latitude and longitude between plus or minus 5 degrees and latitude, and then from about 170 west to 120 west. So what we can do is create a mask using the geomask function, and this will just make all the true values for grid cells that are within this range. And then we'll contour this mask just to give an idea of the area that we're looking at. Okay, so we've contoured the mask, and we see this box. This is the Niño 3.4 box. And there are other boxes that people have suggested as good ways of defining ENSO. You can come up with your own if you'd like, but the most common one is this Niño 3.4 box. And a common way to look at El Nino is simply to average sea surface temperatures within that box. CDT has some functions that are really good for doing that. Local is a way of taking a spatial average of a certain region, like this box, and you can even do an area-weighted average. Here we're using the CDT area function. And for this particular case, the area of the grid cells doesn't really vary much within this small area close to the equator. Nonetheless, to do it properly, we really do like to do this area-weighted average. we'll just plot an anomaly of sea surface temperature, anomaly map of sea surface temperature anomalies within this Nino 3.4 box. And already we have something that looks very similar to what we started out this video with. We have these temperature anomalies with peaks and troughs every 5 to 7 years. And so if we compare it again to the ENSO index calculated with the ENSO function, in fact, just looking at our sea surface temperature anomalies comes up with pretty much the same result. That's because that's what the ENSO function is doing. It's calculating the average temperature within that 3.4 Nino 3.4 box. Now, how does this relate to EOFs? Again, that's really been the theme of this video so far, is EOFs, and we've got these two concepts kind of going in tandem, EOFs and these temperature averages. Well, so far we've calculated the ENSO index, and we've calculated the first principal component of the deseasoned, detrended sea surface temperatures. How do they compare? Well, you can compare them directly, and you see that they're very, they follow a very clear pattern. Using the CDT function polyplot, you can plot this polynomial and fit a line through it. And just to plot the two time series together, I'm going to scale the principal component time series just by the slope of this line, which is the trend. And this is just so we can compare directly the first principal component against the mean sea surface temperatures within that Nino 3.4 box. So here we've gotten the scalar factor, and we're going to multiply that by the first principal component time series and compare it to the index calculated by the ENSO function. Okay, and here we have the anomalies plotted with the shading, the blue and red shading, and those are the ENSO anomalies. And then on top of that, I've plotted the scaled first principal component from the EOFs. And what you should see is that they do agree quite well. They are really just two different ways of measuring the same thing. EOFs are probably the more proper way to do it, because that's actually looking at the grand spatial pattern, and the Nino 3.4 box is really just a convenient shorthand. Nonetheless, they're really pretty similar, and they're going to tell you about the same thing, and if you interpret the differences between them too much, you might just be interpreting noise. Anyway, I hope that clears up a little bit about what EOFs are, what is El Nino, and how can you use the Climate Data Toolbox to investigate these processes. Thank you.